This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 11, Sports and the Economy. What are the characteristics of commercial sports? Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, Jeff. Good morning. Good to be with you this morning.
It's always good to be together. All right, let's get started. And I thought we would start today's episode by talking about some of the reasons that people love sports. From your research, Jay, what are some of the major reasons that people are so passionate about sports?
Well, there's a long list, and, it's partly, if you've done sports, you like to see other people do it. It's kind of a comparative thing. We all like to see someone exhibit physical skills or overcome barriers or, accomplish certain things that they're really happy with. You can kind of get a little vicarious kick out of that. And whenever you watch a competitive event, there's always tension, excitement wrapped up in it. And especially if you're rooting for one of the competitors or one of the teams. And the other thing is that in most cases, we're watching sports, especially when we go to an event in person, we're watching it with other people we know, family members, friends, people from our school, people from our community, because most of the time when we go to these events, they're local events. And, they're not commercial events. These are put on by volunteers. They're not, if they're revenue generating, it's just to keep the concession stand open and keep the bleachers clean. Basically, that's the only thing the revenues go for. But basically what happens while you're there is your identity gets reaffirmed. So it's a comforting kind of an experience, even though there's tension, excitement. And in some cases, you really get a kick out of engaging in personal expression. You might wear a particular jersey. You might paint your face, in some cases. You have your school colors on. So, it's affirming an identity that's important to you at that time in your life. And it's also affirming your connection with the school, with your community. So all of those things are positive. And when you think about it in that way, this is a sociological experience for fans at a local event like that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. As you were talking, the concept that came into my mind is Emil Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence, which we get to the chapter on religion, we'll talk about it then more. But this is just quickly, basically the idea that when you come together in a group and it's emotionally charged, the emotions of the group become infectious and you feel like you're a part of something larger than just yourself. And that is incredibly powerful. And then you project that onto the space and the objects that are a part of that space.
Right.
And so then, whether if it's a religious experience, right, that religious space becomes sacred. But in the sporting context, right, the sporting context becomes sacred. It becomes this sacred space for us. That's incredibly powerful, and just it moves us because humans, we are we're rational, but we're also emotional creatures, and our emotions. We'll come back to this issue of like rational thought and emotional thought, but our emotional thought is so we experience it so profoundly But Jay, I wanted to ask you something, and that's, would you say that the people who organize and stage most of the sporting events that we watch share fans' motivations and passions when they're staging these events?
Yeah, I think here we have to make a distinction that I started to make already, and that is when it's a local event and you have parents at the concession stand or you have teachers, kind of sitting with the students in the stands and everything, though, and the people who organize that event, the athletic department, the other people at a school, for example, uh, that that they're sharing that experience. They're doing it because they have the same kind of emotional connections that the spectators do. Okay, so they're sharing that experience and they're actually trying to manage that experience in a way that maximizes that pleasure associated with being involved. But once you move to commercial sports, what happens is all that management decision making moves further and further away from those emotional moments, and it starts to be specifically managed to create an ideal context for generating revenues. And of course, creating positive emotional experiences is part of that. But then there's the secondary, which may be primary in most cases, primary goal is, okay, I'm happy that everybody's experiencing these emotions, and let's get them to the concession stand. Let's get them to the merchandise sales area, and let's sell them season tickets. So, the revenue generation becomes the primary goal. And when you watch those team owners and administrators sitting in their boxes, they're concerned with the commercial aspects of what are going on primarily. They're enjoying the game too in some cases, but we've got a totally different frame of mind.
So then, how then, Jay, might we understand the disjuncture or incongruence between most fans' passion for sports and the calculations of the business people who stage specifically commercial sporting events? And it's a nice distinction you're making between local events and commercial events. So how might we understand this disjuncture or inconsistency between the passion that fans bring to sports and the calculations that the business people bring to commercial sport?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing you can do is just look around. When you're going to a high school game, a local high school game, that non-commercial kind of an event, what you see is that the spectators are not being managed so much on a moment-to-moment basis. But if you go to a professional game and just take a look and do the comparison, what you find is that people are segregated by social class within the stadium. And that's done for a purpose because, there's different ticket prices, there's different kinds of services that you get. So there's all these distinctions that are grounded in commercial decision-making that you don't see at that local event. And so you start to see that you are being managed in ways that if you stop and think about it critically, you might have some questions about. And I think that's an important thing. As a sociologist, I do that all the time. And it really attunes me into a completely different aspect of the experience.
And that's such a good point, because getting back to where we started is, why do most of us, right? We talk about fans, athletes. Why do most of us engage in sport is because of our passions, our emotions, our fundamental human need for excitement, for connection. Again, as you said, sport consumption is a generally collective process. I mean, yes, we do watch sports alone sometimes, but most of us prefer to watch it with friends, family. We talk about it. we relive those powerful memories, we relive those powerful experiences through memory that we share when talking or writing about it or doing whatever. And I call all of that a romantic orientation towards sports because, thinking in the sense of 19th century romanticism, right? That it's about the power of emotion and how we form our identities. And that is diametrically opposed to the commercial orientation that the business people bring to it. Because for them, our human need for excitement, for bonding, for community is something that can get turned into a product, a commodity that can be sold at a profit. They don't care about our human needs except to the degree they can profit off of our human needs. And that's why a franchise, I should say, will leave your community.
Yeah.
Right? I'm from Oakland. We created, right? The community created the Raiders. There was actually a lottery to pick a name back in the 1960s. The entire city was participate in the naming of the Raiders. Well, people felt ownership over the Raiders. Like me growing up as a little kid, watching them, cheering for them. It's like, that's your team, except not in a legal sense.
Right.
You didn't have legal ownership of the team. Al Davis and now Mark Davis have legal ownership of the team, and they get to decide what to do with it. And if there's more money to be made in Los Angeles or Las Vegas, they will break the hearts of a couple of million people to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a quick little example, some of the first baseball stadiums that were built in the United States were built by people who had a vested financial interest in mass transportation. And what they were doing is they wanted people to start taking mass transportation train lines in Chicago, for example, to Comiskey Park, to Wrigley Field. And so what they were doing is they were actually locating a stadium to help them make money on mass transportation. And that was stuff that the local people didn't know about. Now, there are some people in local areas now that are becoming a little bit wiser to that kind of an orientation of the wealthy people who are trying to use sport to increase their fortunes. And they're having objections to that, especially when it involves using public money to create those stadiums or to create those mass transportation lines and so on. So to increase the value of a franchise. So those are the kinds of underlying things that have been going on for a century now. And they've become so sophisticated that private equity companies now are jumping in to invest in professional and intercollegiate sports even.
Jay, we're going to have to do an episode just on stadium building and urban planning. There's so much I want to say in response to your observation to bring us up to the present. But I think what you're getting at and is what this term overdetermination, right? It helps us to understand, right? This contradiction between fans that consume sporting events for emotional reasons and the business people that produce sporting events for calculated reasons. And this overdetermination, this is the idea that there is something outside of sports that creates the social, political, and economic context in which sporting events happen, right? There is a logic to it that organizes it. And in the sociology of sport, that thing is often called neoliberal capitalism, right? Or the example of the early stadiums, right, is a different stage of capitalism besides neoliberal capitalism. But again, it's this outside structuring force that creates a logic that helps explain what actually unfolds in those spaces. But Jay, can you just provide a brief outline of what's meant by neoliberal capitalism?
Yeah, I certainly will. It's a really important concept. But before I do, I just want to summarize what you just said in sociological terms. Context is close to everything. And, that's one of the things that we oftentimes forget is we get involved in the immediacy and the localism of what's going on. And we don't think of the larger context. But your point is that it's that larger context that is structuring our experiences and oftentimes setting us up so that we give certain kinds of meanings to those experiences. So basically, and I don't want to get wrapped up in too much of this history, but neoliberalism started at this idea of neoliberalism started after the Great Depression, when we were really concerned among the allies, so to speak, of recovering from the war, building economies, creating vital societies, and avoiding what the Soviets were doing and the East Germans were doing, creating communism for what they thought were similar purposes. And so neoliberalism is organized, and when I say organized, it's a set of ideas, beliefs, and processes and forms of economic organization that revolve around low taxes, political deregulation and privatization, free markets. So no government interference, or very little government interference, the pursuit of individual economic self-interest, anti-collectivism, focusing on individualism and individual self-interest and individual responsibility, and the notion that economic inequality is an inevitable and a natural outgrowth of economic prosperity and growth, and that the people who are the smartest, the wisest, the best decision makers, those are the people who are going to become successful. And the people who are not those things, they're the ones who are not going to be as successful. So inherent in this idea of neoliberalism is that economic inequality is natural and positive. So we don't need to try to get rid of it, because it is the foundational basis for motivation within a capitalist economy. So it's the basis for progress and development, economic inequality. So, it sounds pretty simple, but let me tell you, it's started to take on a life of its own as we moved through at the Second World War, came out of the Second World War, and started to grow again, in terms of recovering from the war. And then during the 1980s, it really came into everyday life in ways that affected all of us. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980 and took office in 81, during his inaugural speech, he was talking about the problems that exist in the United States. And basically, he said that if we want to eliminate major problems in the United States and achieve peace and prosperity, government is not the solution. In fact, government is the problem. And that was a one-sentence summary of neoliberalism that he used to guide his 8 years in office. And at the same time he was doing that, Margaret Thatcher in England, the prime minister, said during one of her major presentations, there is no society. There are only individuals and their families, and they must think of themselves first. So it was this move away from this collective notion of community and towards this notion of individual self-interest is the way we grow and prosper.
Thank you. That's a very succinct summary. of a very complicated idea. And I just want to add one little thing for clarity, because you said how neoliberalism really gets its start after the Great Depression. And I think that's really true in terms of the ideas.
Right.
But in that post-World War II period, the ideas were pretty radical, because coming out of the war, the immediate period after the war, what we saw in the United States and across Europe and in other parts of the world is the embrace of an activist state and heavy regulation. You know, if you're in the United States and you're familiar with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, right, that really captures the sort of heavy government involvement and regulation of the economy, which in fact was very important after the Second World War, because after wars, especially large ones, economies tend to be really unstable and go into recession and depression. And what that very regulative model of capitalism did is stabilize the markets and the economy. But as Jay-Z said, fast forward to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, Thatcher 79, Reagan 1980. The other thing that Reagan said to characterize that earlier period about that was democratic controlled, Axis and liberal.
Right.
Such a brilliant political phrase that captured and demonized that earlier collectivist model of and community-oriented model of capitalism, to replace it with a very market-centered model of capitalism. So we've talked about neoliberal capitalism in really an abstract way, and I think very effectively. But I just want to give a few concrete examples, and Jay, I'm sure you have others that you might want to throw in. And in this episode, we'll probably do a lot of listing because there is so much for us to talk about in so little time. But one of the things that listeners might be familiar with is, over the last few years, we've seen the rise of high-profile influencer boxing matches, starting with KSI fighting Logan Paul in 2018 and 2019. And now we're supposed to see Jake Paul fight Mike Tyson. I'm not sure that it was supposed to be in July, but Tyson had has an ulcer, I think. And so that's been delayed. But Mike Tyson, who was the heavyweight champion of the world in the 1980s and 1990s, right, fighting a YouTube influencer. Think about this. How many people watch the Super Bowl for either the commercials or the halftime show more than they watch it for the game itself? Why do alternative sports, from skateboarding to mountain biking to snowboarding to ultimate, get pulled into the heroic broadcast orientation that so many of them began as alternatives to? Suddenly, gambling is ubiquitous across the sporting landscape. Athletes are all becoming experts at self-branding and promotion across a range of media. And this is one of my favorites. Your college bookstore sells very few books, but it sells a lot of branded merchandise for the various sports teams. And I don't know if you want to do you have any examples you want to throw in, or do you think that's enough?
Well, I think that you just summarized 60 years of what's been going on. And I think that for people who have grown up in it and not looked at it in terms of asking critical questions and looking at some of the history, you just kind of accept this as the way things are. But actually, this has been highly orchestrated, and it's been tied to the neoliberal ideology that we started talking about. That basically the people who were making money as this happened became heroes. In other words, they were the epitome of what a society was supposed to be. And once that orientation started to take hold, then they had a major advantage in terms of increasing their power, influence, and wealth. And they did it by making sure that the brands through which they were making their money and increasing their power and influence, making sure that those brands were a part of everyday life, whether it be a sport team, a jersey, a particular product that's being sold at a stadium or anywhere else, so to speak. And so basically what happened was that this whole notion of neoliberalism started to move into being actually written on the bodies of people. And you can't get closer. When somebody wanted to show that they owned cattle, for example, on the range, what did they do? They branded the cow. And what has happened with a lot of the clothes we wear? We have been branded. And that brand is a little bit different than the brand that went on the cow. It's less painful for sure, but basically it's doing the same thing. It's showing that someone has some kind of an ownership of you, and they've made money on it. So the purpose then, the strategy has been to create brands, to get people to buy into them as being representations of themselves rather than the wealth, power, and influence of the billionaires and multimillionaires who are creating those brands. So that's basically where we are. And by the way, sport is an exemplar when it comes to that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about how sport is an exemplar of that specifically. We started out talking about the pleasures, the passions that we as either athletes or fans gain from participating in sport, whether we're doing it as the athlete or we're watching it as a fan. And so much of it is about our emotional connections to the event, to the objects within the event, and even more so, the people that we do it with, whether it's our teammates, our family, our friends that we watch with. That these are about relations of intimacy, and very powerful relations of intimacy that are just charged with our emotions. And again, the marketers, they look at those powerful, intimate relationships we have that we need, and they see that as a money-making opportunity. They can take our intimacies and turn our intimacies into commodities that can be sold. It's very hard for someone, especially like in a corporation, to tell you what to do. But what they want to do is they want to manage you. And the way they manage, and when I say manage you, I mean manage your consumption power, your use of money. And they manage you by managing your emotions. Mm-hmm. And that is right? We're not like, this is not about saying that we're dumb, that we're being duped, that we don't know what we're doing. We know very well what we're doing, whether you're, walking around as a unpaid billboard for a corporation, or you're expressing your relationship to your family, friends, your community, whatnot, right? We know very well what we're doing, but that doesn't mean we aren't being manipulated at the same time. And this gets to my next question for you, Jay. How is this all related to this phrase that we use in the textbook that comes from Antonio Gramsci, called forming ideological outposts in people's minds?
Yeah, that it's a little bit complicated, but to try to simplify it, we are always indebted to the people who provide us with opportunities to experience pleasure. And in a sense, that's what happens with sport, is that certain corporations and individuals are providing us with opportunities to experience pleasure. And that makes us willing to buy into into their interests, basically. And so we wear the shirt that they sell. We buy the product that they are promoting. And by the way, all you have to do is look at a Super Bowl commercial. Those corporations are paying $7 million for 30 seconds of your time. And they think it's worth it. In fact, Amazon and Google paid $16.8 million each for 90-second commercials during the 2020 Super Bowl. Now, they're not dumb. They have people working on this, doing research on this. They knew that it was worth it to spend $16.8 million to get inside your head. And in the process, you are becoming an outpost to deliver messages for them by wearing branded products, by consuming branded products. Coca-Cola and McDonald's are spending billions of dollars every 4 years to sponsor the Olympics. They don't do that because they like sport. They're doing that because of exactly what you've just said. They know that the people who are tuning into the Olympics, the Super Bowl, and other sporting events are manipulable. They're malleable. They're vulnerable to these messages. So they are willing to pay for it.
And marketing has a name for this. They call it experience marketing. It's really taken off, not ironically, since the 1980s, right? With the start of neoliberal capitalism, there were new ideas in terms of how do you conceptualize marketing and advertising itself. And here's the basic idea. We talk about it in the chapter, which if you haven't already read, you'll be able to read. But it's the idea that when you say we'll just focus on sporting events because that's what we're talking about. You go to the sporting event, you have a profound experience. That experience is collective. It's you in relationship to the event. It's you in relationship to the people that you're with. And as we said before, right, it generates that collective effervescence. And then you can relive that experience through memory that you talk about with other people. Well, that is what marketers are selling. They're selling the trace of the experience through memory, and it's why we will pay so much more money for a t-shirt that we bought in the stadium. Because all it is a piece of cloth or some other kind of material. You could get it for a fraction of the price. It will do the exact same thing functionally, right? Which is protect you from the sun or the rain or whatever. But because you connect it to that moment, that emotionally charged moment and those memories, it has far more value to you personally, and therefore it has far more financial value. It can be sold to you at a much higher price. And that's what we see throughout sport marketing right now, particularly, again, at the commercialized events. It's why those Super Bowl commercials are so much fun to watch, why they're so creative. I mean, these are some of the best filmmakers in the world making these commercials. The halftime shows, why they're so, they're so magnificent. Go back and watch, go on YouTube and look up the halftime show from any of the first 20 or maybe almost 30 years of the Super Bowl. They're not that much fun. They're not that interesting. And, but I think it was I'm going to probably wrong about the year. I think it's 1999, maybe it's 97. Michael Jackson was the halftime entertainer. Watch that one. Watch the Michael Jackson show from the late 90s compared to the earlier ones. It is so much more exciting and powerful. And then every Super Bowl halftime show has tried to live up to the Michael Jackson Super Bowl. And there's a whole backstory to this too. It maybe some other time we can talk about. But all of these aspects of the Super Bowl that have nothing to do with the game have become such a part of the larger event. And I think this is one of the arguments that we're making here, is that although, right, commercialization, it generates lots of sports spectacles, and many of them are really, really exciting. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I freaking love that Michael Jackson halftime show. I'm enjoying the commercials, right? I mean, I grew up playing football, but I do love the spectacle aspect of it. So we can get a lot of enjoyment out of that. But one of the other things that we're arguing is that with the spectacle comes some serious costs, exclusions, and limitations. And I just want to ask you about that, Jay. I mean, there's so much there, but what for you probably stands out the most in your mind?
In terms of the spectacle itself?
The limitations, the cost, the exclusions, like we focus on the excitement and the shininess of the spectacle. And that gets us to not focus on all of these other things that are, as we'll say, outside of the frame. We're really trained to focus on what's inside the frame. But what we do, and this is why sometimes students aren't happy with us as sociologists, is we do focus on the things outside of the frame.
Right. And we do that by asking a critical question, which, by the way, bursts the bubble. In a sense, all of these memory hooks that have been designed and presented as we're a spectator personally at an event, or whether we're watching it through media, those memory hooks are designed to do exactly what you've been talking about, is to create this emotional connection that carries over to not only tuning in next time, but listening to the commercials. And, by the way, the $7 million for the 30 seconds, that's just a part of the expense that goes into a commercial. It's the production of the commercial. And by the way, after Michael Jackson, entertainers started to understand this is not a halftime show. This is a 20-minute commercial that I am going to get paid for. So everybody wants to do it because it will become a memory hook, not just to the Super Bowl, but to the music that was being played and the artists who are performing it. So, but as soon as you start thinking about that critically, all of a sudden, we add a new dimension or a new way of thinking about this pleasurable experience. We are in fact being manipulated. Now, it may not be a big deal. We're going to spend $15 on music, and that's not that big a deal. But basically, it's hooking us into this whole notion that we can buy who we are, and that branding, even though we don't use the term, has become a part of our life, and we are being agents of the corporations who are paying their CEOs 200 times what the workers in that corporation are making. The average salaries are $13 million a year, and so on and so forth. And it's raising our prices. And when somebody talks about inflation, they immediately blame the president rather than this dynamic that we're talking about, where prices are being raised because they're inside our head and they know they can do it.
Okay, Jay, let me push back on you a little bit here. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. And I'm going to take the role of the skeptical student who have asked me like this question in particular. So, okay, it's a spectacle, right? But the spectacle is really fun. I like it. I mean, my life is hard. Don't I deserve to have some happiness on the weekend when I tune into a game, or a weekday time of the day at this point we can watch sports spectacles? Jay, it's really fun. So what? Why is that bad, Jay?
Okay. Well, I think we probably have to go back to the first chapter and and look at the fact that spectacle starts to push out playfulness. Sport is a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards in a sense. And what we've moved towards with commercialization is we've started to eliminate the play element in sport, and we've started to move the idea of what these memory hooks involve, what they're like, what they're going to lead people to do, further and further away from the spectators and the athletes. So what happens with the spectacle is that the decision making moves further away from the people who are directly involved, and it can have negative consequences. For the athletes, for example, the most recent example in European soccer is that players are starting to complain about workloads they're playing too many games. They're playing too many tournaments. They're traveling too far. The game has gotten too global. They don't have time to rest. Their bodies are being used up. And they're now starting to say, wait a minute, I can't handle this kind of a workload. And by the way, those players, unless they get together and form some kind of a collective bargaining unit, they're stuck because they have no power over decision-making anymore. And that is starting to happen with spectators as well. So you are being managed to such an extent that you lack freedom when you go into that stadium. And you have to watch, if you want to stick around for the second half, you've got to watch all those commercials. And so in a sense, you're giving up some of your discretion in order to continue to experience this pleasure, this emotional pleasure.
So, hey, Jay, I want to give two examples. I'm going to ask you to talk about one, and I'm going to talk about another one that I think helps to illustrate the power of a spectacle here, on top of what you've already said. So the first concrete example I'd like you to talk about is the expression we use, public money for private profits, when it comes to stadium building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I always think of this when I hear the announcer at a game saying, and now it's your Denver Nuggets. It's your New York Yankees. And, well, no, it's not yours. But that's what they want you to think. Because if you think that way, you will give up between $500 million and $1 billion of public money that could be going to schools, to mass transportation, to other infrastructure, clean water, pollution control, in order to build a stadium that will be managed and profited through by billionaire owners as you identify with the team that plays there. And so what happens is that this whole process that we've been talking about with respect to neoliberalism is in operation. And people have been willing to allow public dollars to build these stadiums for private profit. And in fact, when they do it, they see the owner of the team as being a local civic hero. They've got it both ways. They're making a fortune, and they're defined as a hero using your money. So that has one of the things that has grown professional sports in our culture, and people are starting to wonder about the merits of that, and they're starting to raise questions. Do we really want to give $750 million to the owner of the Chicago Bears to build a new stadium on property that we could be using for other things, and money that is desperately needed for other things in Chicago.
We that live in the city limits of a community that has a professional franchise, we're paying through our tax money, and a large percentage and we're giving up that space. There's ongoing tax incentives. A lot of times there's utilities. There's all sorts of ways in which communities subsidize these professional franchises, but a lot of us in the community can't even afford the price of a ticket. And we go over the cost in the chapter for a family of four to go to professional sporting events. For an NFL game, you want to go see the San Francisco 49ers, and it costs you about $1,000 for your family to go to one game.
Yeah.
You have to be able to drop $1,000 of discretionary income on a 3-hour game to be able to afford that. And in the Bay Area, or any other community for that matter, a lot of people can't. And then what I want to add, my example that I want to add, that we talk about in the chapter, is the way in which the spectacles that we love, that are pleasurable. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to go out on a limb and embarrass myself a little bit. I think I'm the only person in the world who really, really loved the Katy Perry Super Bowl halftime show. I thought it was hilarious when she rode out on a giant lion singing, what's that, the Roar song? I don't really know her music that well, but she's not my generation. And then the guy in the floppy shark costume that everyone laughed at. Oh, I loved it. I thought it was great. But anyway, so we love these spectacles. And, even like Jay and I, right? We're critical sports sociologists, and, I don't want to speak for you, but I love the spectacles. But one of the problems here, and this is one of the costs, is they get us to start thinking like these owners that are exploiting communities, as Jay explained very well about stadiums, but they're exploiting their workers, that is their players. And I think just such a good example is Lamar Jackson. We focus on the story of Lamar Jackson in the chapter. Lamar Jackson is this incredibly valuable sport worker because he's a star, he's a celebrity, he's a quarterback in a sports league that is entirely dependent upon quarterbacks for success, but also for their marketing, right? He sells a tremendous amount of tickets and merchandise for the Baltimore Ravens. So he's this incredibly valuable worker, and he wanted a salary that would match the best compensated quarterback at the time that he was negotiating with the Ravens, which was, I'm blanking on his first name, Watson, for the Cleveland Browns, who I believe is not with the Cleveland Browns anymore. He's a very problematic player in a variety of ways, to say the least. In any case, so what Lamar Jackson wanted to do was put his skills up for sale on the market, because that's what workers do. And what did NFL owners do? They agreed not to hire him, because what Cleveland had done with Watson was set for them a very dangerous precedent, that was to give a worker an incredibly high guaranteed salary. I forget the exact amount, but I'm going to say it was like $230 million guaranteed. No NFL players get fully guaranteed contracts. There's all sorts of ways in which the owners will put stipulations on a contract. So you see in the newspaper this incredible number that a player is being paid over some number of years. Very, very rarely does anyone see that full dollar amount. The only thing that they're certain to see is the guaranteed amount, the signing amount. And so nobody would bid on Lamar's services, and that meant he had to go back and deal with the Baltimore Ravens. And in fairness, I mean, I forget the exact amount. It's in the chapter, But it's an incredible amount of money with an incredible amount of guaranteed, millions and millions, over $100 million guaranteed, no question about it. But he still couldn't get what he wanted. And what could be argued, the market says he's valued at. He had to accept a salary below his value because the owners worked collectively, but the players as workers operate individually. Their only collection is the agents that serve them, right? But they really don't negotiate. They don't negotiate other than the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement. Their individual salaries are not negotiated collectively. The CBA just sets a floor under which, wages can't go below. So it really raises a lot of questions about how we think about the relationship between workers and owners. And we learn to think about our own labor relations through the sports that we follow and the sports workers that we follow. We call them players, but that's the owner's language. Right? We talk about, Lamar was a fool because this, that, and the other reason. But it's like, no, the guy's really smart. He was no fool. When we call him a fool and we talk about all this sort of stuff the way that the owners do or the journalists do, we're using the owner's language to think about labor relations. And this is one of the things that's really powerful about the spectacle, is they get us to see the world through the perspective of ownership.
Right. And one of the things that you didn't mention is that they not only in collective bargaining set a limit on the floor, but there's a cap also. And, that's the other issue, that it gets negotiated, but nevertheless, it's a limitation on salaries. And if that would happen in any other industry, there'd be lawsuits all over the place. Well, sport has been able to avoid those lawsuits because they have certain exemptions when it comes to antitrust law and other kinds of laws. But, if you go over a particular amount in terms of your team salaries, then you're taxed. So that keeps owners from going too high with their salaries. And it protects all the owners. Well, that's a nice little arrangement to have, is that we know what our limits are, and then we can make our decisions within that predictable context that we've been able to create. And of course, they say, well, we have to do that in order to keep giving you the sports you want. Well, not exactly true, but enough people believe that they buy in, they buy into the owner's perspective on it.
We've talked a lot about spectacle so far, and I think rightfully so, but there's another structural aspect here, and we're just now talking about it, which is ownership. And one of the things that's really creating a lot of the problems that we're outlining here is the model of private ownership, right? When you talk about the stadiums, for instance, that's an issue of private ownership to a very large degree. And the people that own our leagues, Jay, and the franchises, as you've already said, they tend to be billionaires, and they want to expand their private wealth. That's what business people do, right? They didn't become a billionaire by accident. So let me ask you this, Jay. What do you think might be some advantages to different models of ownership?
Well, actually the owners have tried this already, because I don't have the data right at the tip of my tongue, but when a stadium gets built with public money, and the owner takes over that stadium, the owner doesn't own the stadium. And in fact, the owner doesn't want to own the stadium, because when you own a stadium, you're responsible for maintenance, you're responsible for liability issues, you're responsible for all sorts of things that are expenses. So what they do is they basically take all the revenues that are generated, but they give the stadium is owned by the city, and the city takes care of the expenses in many cases. So, and that's really a big deal when it comes to liability issues. So, because you can't sue a city, so the owner knows that. But if the owner owned the stadium, you could sue the owner, and that would be a major headache for owners. So they've worked out this deal where they are getting money without taking risk. And in the process, the franchise values for the monopoly leagues like Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NHL, the NBA, and so on, those and the now the WNBA and the National Women's Soccer League, those leagues are skating away from liability issues that might compromise franchise values. And in the big men's spectator sports, those franchise values have made people literally billions of dollars. So even though they don't own the stadium, they just own the franchise. And now, my point here is there are all sorts of different ways to set things up. And one of the ways is that when franchise values increase because of this stadium that public dollars built, why shouldn't there be a special tax when that owner sells that recoups some or maybe even all of that money that went into helping develop this franchise and its profit-making abilities in that benefit the team owner. So that's one thing. There's various kinds of public-private combinations that could be used that would earn back that public money that's being spent. So, for example, when you build a stadium, they're now building retail areas around the stadium, and the franchise is making money off of that. Well, why shouldn't the city be making that money off of that, and to help pay back the money that they've donated for the stadium itself? And so there's various kinds of setups that could be arranged. There's a couple of examples. In soccer in Europe, they've all been club owned in the past. So basically, the spectators owned the various football clubs in Europe. And now that's being changed. And multi-billionaires from oil-rich nations and from the United States, and in some cases, wealthy athletes, are buying pieces of those Premier League franchises because they have all sorts of breaks that allow people to make money off of public dollars being invested in police protection and so on and so forth. So basically, we need to rethink the kinds of models that we're using if we're going to use public dollars.
One thing I think listeners should think about, and I always bring this up in the class, why is it of all the North American professional franchises, only the people of Green Bay, Wisconsin do not have to fear their Packers leaving their community?
Yeah, that's the only example we can give in the U.S.
Or Canada, right? In North America. And that's it, right? That's because the community has partial ownership of that franchise, and they would have to agree to relocating the Green Bay Packers. But who would agree to relocating their sports franchise to another community so somebody else can make more money off of that franchise than them, right? And that just gets to the heart of what we're talking about in this episode and why other models of ownership are not only viable, but they might be, for most of us, preferable to what we have right now. Now, Jay, we're running long again, and I got one more question I want to get in here before we wrap up. And this is about college sports. And we've just seen, I mean, between 2023 and 2024, we have just seen massive changes in collegiate sports, right? We've seen the consolidation of the top conferences, leading to the death of the Pac-12, right? That's the conference I grew up with. We've seen where we talked about the growth of gambling, name, image, and likeness. There's now the potential for athletes to be paid for their services directly, and not just, the vague sort of scholarship and room and board and so forth. So with all of this economic change and frankly chaos that we're seeing in collegiate amateur sports, what do you expect to see in the coming years?
Well, I don't expect to see commercialization and commercial interests taking a backseat to any other criteria. And I don't care whether it's education, whether it's the health and well-being of the athletes, whether it's the reputation of the university as an academic institution. It's basically commercial criteria are being used for every decision that's being made. And what I see happening is that people are athletic directors and others in the athletic programs are starting to think like the Europeans are thinking with their soccer teams. Why should we have an Italian league, a Spanish league, a British league, and so on and so forth, when in fact we could take the best teams from each of those leagues and form a European league, and we could make twice as much money than we're making in all of these individual leagues right now. And that's going to happen with, I don't even know if it will be NCAA sports, but there will be 30 plus universities that will form eventually a super league. And that super league will dominate all the media rights sales. They will dominate TV time. They will dominate publicity. They will dominate recruiting. And everybody else will be there picking up the scraps, so to speak. And so I see us heading in that direction. And it's causing some real concern right now at the Division II level and at the so-called minor conferences within Division I, the non-bowl conferences and in football. So they're the ones now who are starting to say, wait a minute, if we've got to start paying athletes, we're going to have to start cutting our programs. And that means cutting a lot of sports that are not generating revenues that we can't afford anymore, cutting the scholarships that go to the people who are playing those sports. And we're going to see a massive change in college sports as these commercial criteria take precedence over any other criteria.
I can't agree with you more, Jay. And where I disagree is very just quibbly points that we don't have time for me to get into right now. But I think the important thing here for students that are listening to take away from this is Jay started out by emphasizing commercialization. And the reason is it gives a structuring logic, as we said. And then you don't really need a crystal ball to understand what is likely to happen in broad strokes. Not in specific details, but in broad strokes, we can see what's coming, right? I mean, and it looks very likely the athletes are going to get paid. Well, Title IX is going to put all sorts of pressure on schools to be able to balance paying, the football and the male football and basketball players, and they're going to have to pay the women athletes as well. And that is just for the smaller schools. It's going to wreak all sorts of havoc, and it's just going to transform the landscape of collegiate sports. I think just as Jay explained. So we should stop right here because we could certainly keep going for another couple of hours if we wanted to. But I'll say this, for our next episode, we're going to be discussing sports and the media. Could they survive without each other? And the short answer is yes, but it wouldn't be nothing like we know right now. And I think the longer answer we'll give in the next episode is no. And then we'll show our notes because that answer is just a little too easy. And I think that today's episode really will help us to understand why sport and the media, as we know them, cannot be separated.
Right. And why we're moving into a post-cable era in sport media and what that means. And so anyways, we'll talk about that next time. I have got so many articles on what's happening with sport media rights and what's anticipated in the future. I think that 10 years from now, the way we consume sports through the media is going to be very different.
100%.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Look forward to the next episode.
All right. Take care.
Bye.